Hi, my name is Charlie Munford, and this is my personal website, Talking Octopus. This website is dedicated mostly to a problem I've been studying and writing about since 2019 that I call epistolution. That is a nickname that combines epistemology, or the study of the sources of knowledge, with evolution, the study of change in organisms. I created this website because I believe we are at a very exciting moment in the history of biology, a time when a major paradigm shift is about to emerge but has not been recognized yet. You might think this is the result of the importance of genes, but it's just the reverse. We've now discovered enough about genes to discount some of their importance and look for another undiscovered process that guides evolution. Have you ever wondered how your own living body really works? Science tells you that your body is made up of trillions of tiny cells that all do different sorts of things. So, how do they all work together and not do the wrong things? What controls the way cells behave? The answer from your science textbook is that there are a set of instructions in each cell in the genetic code. But now that we've taken a look at the genome, we don't see instructions. Instead, there are just templates for building RNAs and proteins that are turned on or off by conditions outside the molecular networks in the nucleus. If you think about this, right away you can see a problem. Unless the genes are able to turn themselves on and off precisely, like logic gates in a computer program, they cannot be responsible for complex functions. The genes cannot be turned on and off randomly. There are nearly infinitely many possible combinations of proteins that would be fatal to life, but cells choose only the correct combinations. Therefore, which proteins are made at which times must be tightly regulated. You might say that the gene regulatory network does this, but this regulatory process is also imprecise and stochastic. What regulates the regulatory network? You realize if you look hard that the function that exists at each level in a cell depends on the conditions outside it. There's no such thing as a gene that controls its own expression or a molecule that controls its own replication. Life is a process that occurs in fluid water. In a fluid, every set of molecules is controlled by the set of molecules outside it. This is a big problem for our explanation of the biological world. Everything we understand today about biology depends on the assumption that the heritable genome contains the assembly and behavioral instructions for organisms, and that these function like logic gates in a computer. But this assumption is simply false. Instead, the genome is like a set of piano keys. Changing or replacing the keys certainly has a big impact on the tune, but the keys of a piano don't tell the piano what song to play. There are an almost infinite number of possible tunes that could be played with the same piano keys, and the same is true of the genome. But a piano obviously is played by an external player. Keys do not play themselves, and neither do the genes in the nucleus of a cell express themselves. So what is the piano player in biological life? What makes the gene expression follow a functional pattern rather than a dysfunctional one? Most biologists who have thought about this problem have concluded that there aren't any instructions for life, that life is simply an emergent phenomenon that occurs when interactions of a certain sort take place between the tiny parts of the cell. And most of them are satisfied by this explanation because they assume that whatever obscure mechanism causes this, it was something that randomly occurred by chance at the origin of life, and since then the increasing complexity is inherited. The story goes that the inheritance of this mechanism made it possible for natural selection to make arbitrary modifications that increase survival and reproduction over the course of evolutionary time, so that whatever mechanism we have now need not resemble anything that life began with necessarily. But this view is equally impossible. Inherited function cannot be guided by the interactions of the cell as a whole because these interactions are highly stochastic. Two adjacent cells with the same genome may express the same protein 1,000 times more or less when compared to each other. And yet the two cells have inherited the same structure and same genome. So what accounts for the differences in gene expression between the two cells? More importantly, what makes each cell express just the genes it needs to survive and function in its special location in a multicellular organism? If there are no instructions at all, then the stochasticity of fluid interactions of any sort at a molecular level would quickly cause us all to dissolve into a disorganized mass of jelly. So this possibility is ruled out also. There has to be a highly precise controlling mechanism to keep an extremely complex physical process like an animal at an exact temperature, metabolism, developmental phase, and morphological form. It's pure nonsense to imagine that this is controlled by chance interactions. That's why textbooks continue to insist that the genome contains instructions. Where else could the instructions be? We are at a crossroads. We need a new theory. The stage is set for a complete redefinition of what life is. I think that the answer to this riddle must be that the instructions for life come from the external world, what the biologist Jacob von Uexküll called the Umwelt. It's the world as felt by an organism subjectively. These external conditions are both stable enough to be precise and flexible enough to cause functional change. If an organism is something that only contains heritable templates and no instructions, it must be these instructing influences of the Umwelt that force the organism into an organized form. It's called self-organization. The instructions cannot be derived from the interactions in the middle. It's incoherent. They have to be all the way at the bottom in the genes or all the way at the top in the Umwelt. And there's another serious point I need to make here. We cannot explain this self-organizing mechanism by referencing natural selection because it's a circular argument. In order for natural selection to begin, something had to already be seeking its own self-organization. The question isn't why some life forms survive and reproduce better than others. The question is why all of them don't go extinct. If organisms were sorting randomly between arbitrary modifications to themselves with no preference for survival, they would all eventually, through random selection, land on configurations incompatible with life. And yet they do not do so. Natural selection requires another, more primary process. This property life has of seeking its own function is called purposive behavior. We have not recognized this because we have been taught to ignore it. Science has been afraid that to admit purposive behavior was to admit the existence of God, but this is not so. There could also be a materialistic explanation for it if we search for it. And search we must, because purposive behavior must be presupposed before natural selection explains anything. Natural selection cannot provide the explanation for purposive behavior, and purposive behavior must exist on every level for which natural selection operates, on single cells and also on multicellular beings. I believe that everything in the world has a comprehensible cause. There's no justification for this belief, but I hold it nonetheless. I believe we have to keep searching for good explanations when our existing theories fail us. Good explanations are unified, logical, informative, testable, and hard to vary. And I believe one exists for everything. Therefore, I believe that we can uncover the mechanism that's responsible for purposive behavior, if we try. I've called this mechanism epistolution because it is the process that brings knowledge into organisms, makes them function in their context. Epistolution is the property of being able to acquire knowledge that comprises causal inferences about the world around you that permits you to be able to survive in it. To know is to understand in some way what causes what. I am willing to take a further step. I think epistolution explains our moral sense. We obey the knowledge we acquire. What is the right behavior for me given my context? I use my knowledge to decide. And therefore, this means that all organisms must be moral in some way in their own forms. When we acquire these inferences, we hold them in our physical bodies in the configuration of our molecules. That must be why complex organisms like humans require sleep every 16 hours, because we have to reconfigure our molecules continually to remain alive. The instructions we use to do this are our external umwelts, the subjective physical environments we inhabit. And these reconfigurations are Lamarckian. They distinguish between use and disuse, which means an organism is something that is somehow divisible between used and disused cycles or patterns or oscillations of some sort. This mechanism, however it works, must be common to all living cells because all cells contain shareable DNA, and therefore the controlling mechanism must be universal. It is now supposed that we ourselves contain many genes that were once in prokaryotes. Even though we have not yet understood this mechanism or created a viable model of it, we can infer from reasonable argument that it does exist. In exactly the same way, Alfred Wallace and Charles Darwin once inferred that evolution by natural selection existed, long before anything was known about the mechanism responsible for inheritance. Darwin took for granted that a Lamarckian reconfiguration was a necessary part of the theory of life. He mentions it several times in The Origin of Species. This basic assumption was later foolishly removed from biology because we assumed that the sequences in the genome contained logic gates that controlled function. But now this era is officially over, and it's time to recognize that Darwin was right in this respect. Not only is there indeed evolution by natural selection, but function is shaped by a Lamarckian process that we do not understand yet. These two ideas are not incompatible. In fact, the biologist Conrad Waddington discovered a process called genetic assimilation that describes exactly how an acquired characteristic can be subsequently encoded into a genome. An adaptation is made by epigenetic changes. The organism can thus function in a new lifestyle. That lifestyle then comprises new selection pressures that are exerted on the genome, eventually cementing the adaptation by favoring genes that support it. There's nothing mysterious or hard to understand about genetic assimilation, and yet many biologists still believe that Lamarckian inheritance is impossible. If all epigenetic changes were random with respect to function, there would be no such thing as purposive behavior and nothing to explain. But it's obvious that epigenetic changes are biased toward function. All organisms learn and adapt. Think of an arbitrary example. Genes that support longer neck growth in giraffes would be useless or harmful if the giraffes were not already adapting to the scarcity of browse by craning their necks upwards. And of course, this behavior is possible due to epigenetic markings in certain cells, particularly neurons. It's time for a new turn, a new opening in life science. Epistolution is profoundly counterintuitive for those of us trained in contemporary biology. But in other ways, it is terrifyingly simple and quite beautiful. When you make the mental shift to imagining epistolution, suddenly the scales fall from your eyes. All sorts of natural phenomena, from sleep to beauty to senescence to morality to hallucinations and dreams, all become more comprehensible. The purposive seeking of organisms, the way they are intending to thrive, becomes a ballet of majestic coordination. Alliances form and expand. The entire biosphere is connected with itself, not simply in terms of arbitrary impacts on one another, but in terms of intentions and purposes. These insights are, for me, both scientific and spiritual. We are all moral beings, even the flies and the worms and the grasses. We are all attempting to learn from our worlds and change ourselves. Being is not merely for being. Being is for knowing. Please enjoy the resources available in this website and share them with anyone and everyone. If you'd like, write to me with questions, comments, and criticisms. I love your participation and feedback because that is how I learn. Today's Saturday, August 5th, and it's 2023. Bye-bye.